Godfrey Morgan. Chapter 1, in which the reader has the opportunity of buying an island in the Pacific Ocean. An island to sell for cash to the highest bidder, said Dean Felporg, the auctioneer, standing behind his rostrum in the room where the conditions of the singular sale were being noisily discussed. Island for sale, repeated in shrill tones again and again Gingras, the crier, who was threading his way in and out of the excited crowd, closely packed inside the largest saloon in the auction mart at number 10, Sacramento Street. The crowd consisted not only of a goodly number of Americans from the states of Utah, Oregon, and California, but also of a few Frenchmen, who form quite a sixth of the population. Mexicans were there enveloped in their sarapes, Chinamen in their large-sleeved tunics, pointed shoes, and conical hats, one or two Canucks from the coast, and even a sprinkling of Blackfeet, Grosventers, or Flatheads from the banks of the Trinity River. The scene is in San Francisco, the capital of California, but not at the period when the placer mining fever was raging fro to 1852. San Francisco was no longer what it had been then, a caravanserai, a terminus, an inn, where for a night there slept the busy men who were hastening to the gold fields west of the Sierra Nevada. At the end of some 20 years, the old unknown Yerba Buena had given place to a town unique of its kind, peopled by 100,000 inhabitants, built under the shelter of a couple of hills, away from the shore, but stretching off to the farthest heights in the background. A city, in short, which has dethroned Lima, Santiago, Valparaiso, and every other rival, and which the Americans have made the queen of the Pacific, the glory of the western coast. It was the 15th of May, and the weather was still cold. In California, subject as it is to the direct action of the polar currents, the first weeks of this month are somewhat similar to the last weeks of March in Central Europe. But the cold was hardly noticeable in the thick of the auction crowd. The bell with its incessant clangor had brought together an enormous throng, and quite a summer temperature caused the drops of perspiration to glisten on the foreheads of the spectators, which the cold outside would have soon solidified. Do not imagine that all these folks had come to the auction room with the intention of buying. I might say that all of them had but come to see. Who was going to be mad enough, even if he were rich enough, to purchase an isle of the Pacific, which the government had in some eccentric moment decided to sell? Would the reserve price ever be reached? Could anybody be found to work up the bidding? If not, it would scarcely be the fault of the public crier, who tried his best to tempt buyers by his shoutings and gestures and the flowery metaphors of his harangue. People laughed at him, but they did not seem much influenced by him. An isle to sell, repeated Gingras. But not to buy, answered an Irishman whose pocket did not hold enough to pay for a single pebble. An island which at the valuation will not fetch $6 an acre, said the auctioneer. And which won't pay an eighth per cent, replied a big farmer who was well acquainted with agricultural speculations. An isle which measures quite 64 miles round and has an area of 225,000 acres. Is it solid on its foundation? Asked a Mexican, an old customer at the liquor bars, whose personal solidity seemed rather doubtful at the moment. An isle with forests still virgin, repeated the crier, with prairies, hills, watercourses. Warranted? Asked a Frenchman, who seemed rather inclined to nibble. Yes, warranted, added Felporg, much too old at his trade to be moved by the chaff of the public. For 2 years. To the end of the world. Beyond that. A freehold island, repeated the crier, an island without a single noxious animal, no wild beasts, no reptiles. No birds, added a wag. No insects, inquired another. Island for the highest bidder, said Dean Felporg, beginning again. Come, gentlemen, come, have a little courage in your pockets. Who wants an island in perfect state of repair, never been used, an island in the Pacific, that ocean of oceans? The valuation is a mere nothing. It is put at $1,100,000. Is there anyone will bid? Who speaks first? You, sir. You over there nodding your head like a porcelain mandarin. Here is an island, a really good island. Who says an island? "Pass it round," said a voice as if they were dealing with a picture or a vase. And the room shouted with laughter, but not a $50 was bid. However, if the lot could not be passed round, the map of the island was at the public disposal. The whereabouts of the portion of the globe under consideration could be accurately ascertained. There was neither surprise nor disappointment to be feared in that respect. Situation, orientation, outline, altitudes, levels, hydrography, climatology, lines of communication, all these were easily to be verified in advance. People were not buying a pig in a poke, and most undoubtedly there could be no mistake as to the nature of the goods on sale. Moreover, the innumerable journals of the United States, especially those of California, with their dailies, bi-weeklies, weeklies, bi-monthlies, monthlies, their reviews, magazines, bulletins, and had been for several months directing constant attention to the island, whose sale by auction had been authorized by Act of Congress. The island was Spencer Island, which lies in the west-southwest of the Bay of San Francisco, about 460 miles from the Californian coast, in 32 degrees 15 north latitude and degrees 18 west longitude, reckoning from Greenwich. It would be impossible to imagine a more isolated position, quite out of the way of all maritime or commercial traffic, although Spencer Island was relatively not very far off and situated practically in American waters. But thereabouts the regular currents diverging to the north and south have formed a kind of lake of calms, which is sometimes known as the whirlpool of Fleurieu. It is in the center of this enormous eddy, which has hardly an appreciable movement, that Spencer Island is situated, and so it is sighted by very few ships. The main routes of the Pacific, which join the new to the old continent and lead away to China or Japan, run in a more southerly direction. Sailing vessels would meet with endless calms in the whirlpool of Fleurieu, and steamers, which always take the shortest road, would gain no advantage by crossing it. Hence ships of neither class know anything of Spencer Island, which rises above the waters like the isolated summit of one of the submarine mountains of the Pacific. Truly, for a man wishing to flee from the noise of the world, seeking quiet in solitude, what could be better than this island, lost within a few hundred miles of the coast? For a voluntary Robinson Crusoe, it would be the very ideal of its kind, only of course he must pay for it. And now, why did the United States desire to part with the island? Was it for some whim? No, a great nation cannot act on caprice in any matter, however simple. The truth was this: situated as it was, Spencer Island had for a long time been known as a station perfectly useless. There could be no practical result from settling there. In a military point of view, it was of no importance, for it only commanded an absolutely deserted portion of the Pacific. In a commercial point of view, there was a similar want of importance, for the products would not pay the freight either inwards or outwards. For a criminal colony, it was too far from the coast, and to occupy it in any way would be a very expensive undertaking. So it had remained deserted from time immemorial, and Congress, composed of eminently practical men, had resolved to put it up for sale, on one condition only, and that was that its purchaser should be a free American citizen. There was no intention of giving away the island for nothing, and so the reserve price had been fixed at $1,100,000. This amount for a financial society dealing with such matters was a mere bagatelle if the transaction could offer any advantages, but as we need hardly repeat, it offered none, and competent men attached no more value to this detached portion of the United States than to one of the islands lost beneath the glaciers of the pole. In one sense, however, the amount was considerable. A man must be rich to pay for this hobby, for in any case it would not return him a halfpenny per cent. He would even have to be immensely rich, for the transaction was to be a cash one, and even in the United States, it is as yet rare to find citizens with $1,100,000 in their pockets, who would care to throw them into the water without hope of return. And Congress had decided not to sell the island under the price. $1,100,000, not a cent less, or Spencer Island would remain the property of the Union. It was hardly likely that anyone would be mad enough to buy it on the terms. Besides, it was expressly reserved that the proprietor, if one offered, should not become king of Spencer Island, but president of a republic. He would gain no right to have subjects, but only fellow citizens who could elect him for a fixed time and would be free from re-electing him indefinitely. Under any circumstances, he was forbidden to play at monarchy. The Union could never tolerate the foundation of a kingdom, no matter how small, in American waters. This reservation was enough to keep off many an ambitious millionaire, many an aged nabob, who might like to compete with the kings of the Sandwich, the Marquesas, and the other archipelagos of the Pacific. In short, for one reason or other, nobody presented himself. Time was getting on, the crier was out of breath in his efforts to secure a buyer, the auctioneer orated without obtaining a single specimen of those nods which his estimable fraternity are so quick to discover, and the reserve price was not even mentioned. However, if the hammer was not wearied with oscillating above the rostrum, the crowd was not wearied with waiting around it. The joking continued to increase, and the chaff never ceased for a moment. One individual offered $2 for the island, costs included. Another said that a man ought to be paid that for taking it. And all the time, the crier was heard with, "An island to sell, an island for sale." And there was no one to buy it. "Will you guarantee that there are flats there?" said Stumpy, the grocer of Merchant Street, alluding to the deposits so famous in alluvial gold mining. "No," answered the auctioneer, "but it is not impossible that there are, and the state abandons all its rights over the gold lands." "Haven't you got a volcano?" asked Oakhurst, the barkeeper of Montgomery Street. "No volcanoes," replied Dean Felporg. "If there were, we could not sell at this price." An immense shout of laughter followed. "An island to sell, an island for sale," yelled Gingras, whose lungs tired themselves out to no purpose. "Only $1, only a $half, only a cent above the reserve," said the auctioneer for the last time, "and I will knock it down, once, twice." Perfect silence. "If nobody bids, we must put the lot back, once, twice. $1,200,000. The four words rang through the room like 4 shots from a revolver. The crowd, suddenly speechless, turned towards the bold man who had dared to bid. It was William W. Kolderup of San Francisco. Chapter 2. How William W. Kolderup of San Francisco was at loggerheads with J.R. Taskinar of Stockton. A man extraordinarily rich, who counted dollars by the million as other men do by the thousand. Such was William W. Kolderup. People said he was richer than the Duke of Westminster, whose income is some $4 million a year, and who can spend his $10,000 a day, or $7 every minute, richer than Senator Jones of Nevada, who has $35 million in the funds, richer than Mr. Mackay himself, whose annual $13,750,000 give him $1,560 per hour, or half a dollar to spend every second of his life. I do not mention such minor millionaires as the Rothschilds, the Vanderbilts, the Dukes of Northumberland, or the Stuarts, nor the directors of the powerful Bank of California and other opulent personages of the Old and New Worlds whom William W. Kolderup would have been able to comfortably pension. He could, without inconvenience, have given away $1 million just as you and I might give away a shilling. It was in developing the early placer mining enterprises in California that our worthy speculator had laid the solid foundations of his incalculable fortune. He was the principal associate of Captain Sutter, the Swiss, in the localities, where in 1848 the first traces were discovered. Since then, luck and shrewdness combined had helped him on, and he had interested himself in all the great enterprises of both worlds. He threw himself boldly into commercial and industrial speculations. His inexhaustible funds were the life of hundreds of factories. His ships were on every sea. His wealth increased not in arithmetical but in geometrical progression. People spoke of him as one of those few milliardaires who never know how much they are worth. In reality, he knew almost to a dollar, but he never boasted of it. At this very moment, when we introduce him to our readers with all the consideration such a many-sided man merits, William W. Calderup branch offices scattered over the globe, 80,000 employees in America, Europe, and Australia, 300,000 correspondents, a fleet of 500 ships, which continually plowed the ocean for his profit, and he was spending not less than $1 million a year in bill stamps and postages. In short, he was the honor and glory of opulent Frisco, the nickname familiarly given by the Americans to the Californian capital. A bid from William W. Calderup could not but be a serious one, and when the crowd in the auction room had recognized who it was that by $100,000 had capped the reserve price of Spencer Island, there was an irresistible sensation. The chaffing ceased instantly, jokes gave place to interjections of admiration, and cheers resounded through the saloon. Then a deep silence succeeded to the hubbub, eyes grew bigger, and ears opened wider. For our part, had we been there, we would have had to hold our breath, that we might lose nothing of the exciting scene which would follow should anyone dare to bid against William W. Calderup. But was it probable? Was it even possible? No, and at the outset, it was only necessary to look at William W. Calderup to feel convinced that he could never yield on a question where his financial gallantry was at stake. He was a big, powerful man, with huge head, large shoulders, well-built limbs, firmly knit and tough as iron. His quiet but resolute look was not willingly cast downwards. His gray hair, brushed up in front, was as abundant as if he were still young. The straight lines of his nose formed a geometrically drawn right-angled triangle. No mustache, his beard cut in Yankee fashion bedecked his chin, and the two upper points met at the opening of the lips and ran up to the temples in pepper and salt whiskers. Teeth of snowy whiteness were symmetrically placed on the borders of a clean-cut mouth, the head of one of those true kings of men who rise in the tempest and face the storm. No hurricane could bend that head, so solid was the neck which supported it. In these battles of the bidders, each of its nods meant an additional $100,000. There was no one to dispute with him. $1,200,000, $1,200,000, said the auctioneer with that peculiar accent which men of his vocation find most effective. Going at $1,200,000, repeated Gingras the crier. You could safely bid more than that, said Oakhurst, the barkeeper. William Calderup will never give in. He knows no one will chance it, answered the grocer from Merchant Street. Repeated cries of hush told the two worthy tradesmen to be quiet. All wished to hear. All hearts palpitated. Dare anyone raise his voice in answer to the voice of William W. Calderup? He, magnificent to look upon, never moved. There he remained as calm as if the matter had no interest for him. But in this those near to him noticed, his eyes were like revolvers loaded with dollars, ready to fire. Nobody speaks, asked Dean Felporg. Nobody spoke. Once, twice. Once, twice, repeated Gingras, quite accustomed to this little dialogue with his chief. Goings. Goings. For $1,200,000 Spencer Island complete. For $1,200,000. That is so, no mistake. No withdrawal. For $1,200,000 Spencer Island. The waistcoats rose and fell convulsively. Could it be possible that at the last second a higher bid would come? Felporg, with his right hand stretched on the table, was shaking his ivory hammer. One rap, two raps, and the deed would be done. The public could not have been more absorbed in the face of a summary application of the law of Justice Lynch. The hammer slowly fell, almost touched the table, rose again, hovered an instant like a sword, which pauses ere the drawer cleaves the victim in twain. Then it flashed swiftly downwards. But before the sharp rap could be given, a voice was heard giving utterance to these four words. $1,300,000. There was a preliminary ah of general stupefaction, then a second ah of not less general satisfaction. Another bidder had presented himself. There was going to be a fight after all. But who was the reckless individual who had dared to come to dollar strokes with William W. Calderup of San Francisco? It was J.R. Taskinar of Stockton. J.R. Taskinar was rich, but he was more than proportionately fat. He weighed pounds. If he had only run second in the last Fat Man show at Chicago, it was because he had not been allowed time to finish his dinner and had lost about a dozen pounds. This colossus, who had had to have special chairs made for his portly person to rest upon, lived at Stockton on the San Joaquin. Stockton is one of the most important cities in California, one of the depot centers for the mines of the South, the rival of Sacramento, the center for the mines of the North. There the ships embarked the largest quantity of Californian corn. Not only had the development of the mines and speculations in wheat furnished J.R. Taskinar with the occasion of gaining an enormous fortune, but petroleum, like another Pactolus, had run through his treasury. Besides, he was a great gambler, a lucky gambler, and he had found poker most prodigal of its favors to him. But if he was a Croesus, he was also a rascal, and no one would have addressed him as honorable, although the title in those parts is so much in vogue. After all, he was a good war horse, and perhaps more was put on his back than was justly his due. One thing was certain, and that was that on many an occasion he had not hesitated to use his derringer, the Californian revolver. Now J.R. Taskinar particularly detested William W. Calderup. He envied him for his wealth, his position, and his reputation. He despised him as a fat man despises a lean one. It was not the first time that the merchant of Stockton had endeavored to do the merchant of San Francisco out of some business or other, good or bad, simply owing to a feeling of rivalry. William W. Calderup thoroughly knew his man, and on all occasions treated him with scorn enough to drive him to distraction. The last success, which J.R. Taskinar could not forgive his opponent, was that gained in the struggle over the state elections. Notwithstanding his efforts, his threats, and his libels, not to mention the millions of dollars squandered by his electoral courtiers, it was William W. Calderup who sat in his seat in the Legislative Council of Sacramento. J.R. Taskinar had learnt, how I cannot tell, that it was the intention of William W. Calderup to acquire possession of Spencer Island. This island seemed doubtless as useless to him as it did to his rival. No matter. Here was another chance for fighting, and perhaps for conquering. J.R. Taskinar would not allow it to escape him. And that is why J.R. Taskinar had come to the auction room among the curious crowd who could not be aware of his designs, why at all points he had prepared his batteries, why before opening fire he had waited till his opponent had covered the reserve, and why when William W. Calderup had made his bid of $1,200,000, J.R. Taskinar, at the moment when William W. Calderup thought he had definitely secured the island, woke up with the words shouted in stentorian tones. $1,300,000. Everybody, as we have seen, turned to look at him. Fat Taskinar. The name passed from mouth to mouth. Yes, Fat Taskinar, he was known well enough. His corpulence had been the theme of many an article in the journals of the Union. I am not quite sure which mathematician it was who had demonstrated by transcendental calculations that so great was his mass that it actually influenced that of our satellite and in an appreciable manner disturbed the elements of the lunar orbit. But it was not J.R. Taskinar's physical composition which interested the spectators in the room. It was something far different which excited them. It was that he had entered into direct public rivalry with William W. Calderup. It was a fight of heroes, dollar versus dollar, which had opened, and I do not know which of the two coffers would turn out to be best lined. Enormously rich were both these mortal enemies. After the first sensation, which was rapidly suppressed, renewed silence fell on the assembly. You could have heard a spider weaving his web. It was the voice of Dean Felporg which broke the spell. For $1,300,000, Spencer Island, declaimed he, drawing himself up so as to better command the circle of bidders. William W. Calderup had turned towards J.R. Taskinar. The bystanders moved back so as to allow the adversaries to behold each other. The man of Stockton and the man of San Francisco were face to face, mutually staring at their ease. Truth compels me to state that they made the most of the opportunity. Never would one of them consent to lower his eyes before those of his rival. $1,400,000, said William W. Calderup. $1,500,000, retorted J.R. Taskinar. $1,600,000. $1,700,000. Have you ever heard the story of the two mechanics of Glasgow who tried which should raise the other highest up the factory chimney at the risk of a catastrophe? The only difference was that here the chimney was of ingots of gold. Each time after the capping bid of J.R. Taskinar, William W. Calderup took a few moments to reflect before he bid again. On the contrary, Taskinar burst out like a bomb and did not seem to require a second to think. $1,700,000, repeated the auctioneer. Now, gentlemen, that is a mere nothing, it is giving it away. And one can well believe that, carried away by the jargon of his profession, he was about to add, the frame alone is worth more than that, when $1,700,000, howled Jingres, the crier. $1,800,000, replied William W. Calderup. $1,900,000, retorted J.R. Taskinar. $2 millions, quoth William W. Calderup, and so quickly that this time he evidently had not taken the trouble to think. His face was a little pale when these last words escaped his lips, but his whole attitude was that of a man who did not intend to give in. J.R. Taskinar was simply on fire. His enormous face was like one of those gigantic railway bullseyes which, screened by the red, signal the stoppage of the train. But it was highly probable that his rival would disregard the block and decline to shut off steam. This J.R. Taskinar felt. The blood mounted to his brows and seemed apoplectically congested there. He wriggled his fat fingers, covered with diamonds of great price, along the huge gold chain attached to his chronometer. He glared at his adversary, and then shutting his eyes so as to open them with a more spiteful expression a moment afterwards. $2,400,000, he remarked, hoping by this tremendous leap to completely rout his rival. $2,700,000, replied William W. Calderup in a peculiarly calm voice. $2,900,000. $3 millions. Yes, William W. Calderup, of San Francisco, said $3 millions. Applause rang through the room, hushed, however, at the voice of the auctioneer, who repeated the bid, and whose oscillating hammer threatened to fall in spite of himself by the involuntary movement of his muscles. It seemed as though Dean Felporg, surfeited with the surprises of public auction sales, would be unable to contain himself any longer. All glances were turned on J.R. Taskinar. That voluminous personage was sensible of this, but still more was he sensible of the weight of these $3 millions, which seemed to crush him. He would have spoken, doubtless to bid higher, but he could not. He would have liked to nod his head. He could do so no more. After a long pause, however, his voice was heard, feeble it is true, but sufficiently audible. $3,500,000. $4 millions, was the answer of William W. Calderup. It was the last blow of the bludgeon. J.R. Taskinar succumbed. The hammer gave a hard rap on the marble table, and Spencer Island fell for $4 millions to William W. Calderup, of San Francisco. I will be avenged, muttered J.R. Taskinar, and throwing a glance of hatred at his conqueror, he returned to the Occidental Hotel. But hip hip hurrah, 3 times thrice, smote the ears of William W. Calderup. Then cheers followed him to Montgomery Street, and such was the delirious enthusiasm of the Americans that they even forgot to favor him with the customary bars of Yankee Doodle. Chapter 3. The Conversation of Fina Holliday and Godfrey Morgan, with a piano accompaniment. William W. Calderup had returned to his mansion in Montgomery Street. This thoroughfare is the Regent Street, the Broadway, the Boulevard des Italiens of San Francisco. Throughout its length, the great artery which crosses the city parallel with its quays is astir with life and movement. Trams there are innumerable, carriages with horses, carriages with mules, men bent on business, hurrying to and fro over its stone pavements, past shops thronged with customers, men bent on pleasure, crowding the doors of the bars, where at all hours are dispensed the Californians' drinks. There is no need for us to describe the mansion of a Frisco nabob. With so many millions, there was proportionate luxury, more comfort than taste, less of the artistic than the practical. One cannot have everything. So the reader must be contented to know that there was a magnificent reception room, and in this reception room, a piano, whose chords were permeating the mansion's warm atmosphere when the opulent Kolderup walked in. "Good," he said, "she and he are there. A word to my cashier, and then we can have a little chat." And he stepped towards his office to arrange the little matter of Spencer Island and then dismiss it from his mind. He had only to realize a few certificates in his portfolio, and the acquisition was settled for. Half a dozen lines to his broker, no more. Then William W. Kolderup devoted himself to another combination, which was much more to his taste. Yes, she and he were in the drawing room, she in front of the piano, he half reclining on the sofa, listening vaguely to the pearly arpeggios which escaped from the fingers of the charmer. "Are you listening?" she said. "Of course." "Yes, but do you understand it?" "Do I understand it, Fina? Never have you played those Old Robin Gray variations more superbly." "But it is not Old Robin Gray, Godfrey. It is Happy Moments." "Oh, yes, I remember," answered Godfrey in a tone of indifference which it was difficult to mistake. The lady raised her two hands, held them suspended for an instant above the keys, as if they were about to grasp another chord, and then with a half-turn on her music stool, she remained for a moment looking at the too tranquil Godfrey, whose eyes did their best to avoid hers. Fina Holliday was the goddaughter of William W. Kolderup. An orphan, he had educated her and given her the right to consider herself his daughter and to love him as her father. She wanted for nothing. She was young, handsome in her way, as people say, but undoubtedly fascinating, a blonde of 16 with the ideas of a woman much older, as one could read in the crystal of her blue-black eyes. Of course, we must compare her to a lily, for all beauties are compared to lilies in the best American society. She was then a lily, but a lily grafted into an eglantine. She certainly had plenty of spirit, but she had also plenty of practical common sense, a somewhat selfish demeanor, and but little sympathy with the illusions and dreams so characteristic of her sex and age. Her dreams were when she was asleep, not when she was awake. She was not asleep now and had no intention of being so. "Godfrey," she continued. "Fina," answered the young man. "Where are you now?" "Near you, in this room." "Not near me, Godfrey, not in this room, but far, far away over the seas, is it not so?" And mechanically, Fina's hand sought the keyboard and rippled along a series of sinking sevenths, which spoke of a plaintive sadness, unintelligible perhaps to the nephew of William W. Kolderup. For such was this young man, such was the relationship he bore towards the master of the house. The son of a sister of this buyer of islands, fatherless and motherless for a good many years, Godfrey Morgan, like Fina, had been brought up in the house of his uncle, in whom the fever of business had still left a place for the idea of marrying these two to each other. Godfrey was in his 23rd year. His education, now finished, had left him with absolutely nothing to do. He had graduated at the university, but had found it of little use. For him, life opened out but paths of ease, go where he would, to the right or the left, whichever way he went, fortune would not fail him. Godfrey was of good presence, gentlemanly, elegant, never tying his cravat in a ring, nor starring his fingers, his wrists, or his shirt front with those jeweled gimcracks so dear to his fellow citizens. I shall surprise no one in saying that Godfrey Morgan was going to marry Fina Holliday. Was he likely to do otherwise? All the proprieties were in favor of it. Besides, William W. Calderup desired the marriage. The two people whom he loved most in this world were sure of a fortune from him, without taking into consideration whether Fina cared for Godfrey or Godfrey cared for Fina. It would also simplify the bookkeeping of the commercial house. Ever since their births, an account had been opened for the boy, another for the girl. It would then be only necessary to rule these off and transfer the balances to a joint account for the young couple. The worthy merchant hoped that this would soon be done, and the balances struck without error or omission. But it is precisely that there had been an omission, and perhaps an error, that we are about to show. An error because at the outset Godfrey felt that he was not yet old enough for the serious undertaking of marriage. An omission because he had not been consulted on the subject. In fact, when he had finished his studies, Godfrey had displayed a quite premature indifference to the world, in which he wanted for nothing, in which he had no wish remaining ungratified, and nothing whatever to do. The thought of traveling round the world was always present to him. Of the old and new continents he knew but one spot, San Francisco, where he was born, and which he had never left except in a dream. What harm was there in a young man making the tour of the globe twice or thrice, especially if he were an American? Would it do him any good? Would he learn anything in the different adventures he would meet with in a voyage of any length? If he were not already satiated with a life of adventure, how could he be answered? Finally, how many millions of leagues of observation and instruction were indispensable for the completion of the young man's education? Things had reached this pass. For a year or more Godfrey had been immersed in books of voyages of recent date, and had passionately devoured them. He had discovered the Celestial Empire with Marco Polo, America with Columbus, the Pacific with Cook, the South Pole with Dumont d'Urville. He had conceived the idea of going where these illustrious travelers had been without him. In truth, he would not have considered an exploring expedition of several years to cost him too dear at the price of a few attacks of Malay pirates, several ocean collisions, and a shipwreck or two on a desert island, where he could live the life of a Selkirk or a Robinson Crusoe. A Crusoe, to become a Crusoe. What young imagination has not dreamt of this in reading, as Godfrey had often, too often done, the adventures of the imaginary heroes of Daniel Defoe and De Wis. Yes, the nephew of William W. Calderup was in this state when his uncle was thinking of binding him in the chains of marriage. To travel in this way with Fina, then become Mrs. Morgan, would be clearly impossible. He must go alone or leave it alone. Besides, once his fancy had passed away, would not she be better disposed to sign the settlements? Was it for the good of his wife that he had not been to China or Japan, not even to Europe? Decidedly not. And hence it was that Godfrey was now absent in the presence of Fina, indifferent when she spoke to him, deaf when she played the airs which used to please him. And Fina, like a thoughtful, serious girl, soon noticed this. To say that she did not feel a little annoyance mingled with some chagrin is to do her a gratuitous injustice, but accustomed to look things in the face, she had reasoned thus. If we must part, it had better be before marriage than afterwards. And thus it was that she had spoken to Godfrey in these significant words. No, you are not near me at this moment, you are beyond the seas. Godfrey had risen. He had walked a few steps without noticing Fina, and unconsciously his index finger touched one of the keys of the piano. A loud 100 hash of the octave below the staff, a note dismal enough, answered for him. Fina had understood him, and without more discussion was about to bring matters to a crisis when the door of the room opened. William W. Calderup appeared, seemingly a little preoccupied as usual. Here was the merchant who had just finished one negotiation and was about to begin another. Well, said he, there is nothing more now than for us to fix the date. The date, answered Godfrey with a start. What date, if you please, uncle? The date of your wedding, said William W. Calderup, not the date of mine, I suppose. Perhaps that is more urgent, said Fina. Hey, what? Exclaimed the uncle. What does that matter? We are only talking of current affairs, are we not? Godfather Will, answered the lady, it is not of a wedding that we are going to fix the date today, but of a departure. A departure? Yes, the departure of Godfrey. continued Fina, of Godfrey who, before he gets married, wants to see a little of the world. You want to go away, you, said William W. Colderup, stepping towards the young man and raising his arms as if he were afraid that this rascal of a nephew would escape him. Yes, I do, uncle, said Godfrey gallantly. And for how long? For 18 months, or 2 years, or more if you will let me, and Fina will wait for me. Wait for you, an intended who intends until he gets away, exclaimed William W. Colderup. You must let Godfrey go, pleaded Fina. I have thought it carefully over. I am young, but really Godfrey is younger. Travel will age him, and I do not think it will change his taste. He wishes to travel, let him travel. The need of repose will come to him afterwards, and he will find me when he returns. What? Exclaimed William W. Colderup. You consent to give your bird his liberty? Yes, for the 2 years he asks. And you will wait for him? Uncle Will, if I could not wait for him, I could not love him. And so saying, Fina returned to the piano, and whether she willed it or no, her fingers softly played a portion of the then fashionable Depart du Fiancé, which was very appropriate under the circumstances. But Fina, without perceiving it perhaps, was playing in a minor, whereas it was written in a major, and all the sentiment of the melody was transformed, and its plaintiveness chimed in well with her hidden feelings. But Godfrey stood embarrassed, and said not a word. His uncle took him by the head, and turning it to the light, looked fixedly at him for a moment or two. In this way he questioned him without having to speak, and Godfrey was able to reply without having occasion to utter a syllable. And the lamentations of the Depart du Fiancé continued their sorrowful theme, and then William W. Colderup, having made the turn of the room, returned to Godfrey, who stood like a criminal before the judge. Then raising his voice, "You are serious?" he asked. "Quite serious," interrupted Fina, while Godfrey contented himself with making a sign of affirmation. "You want to try traveling before you marry Fina? Well, you shall try it, my nephew." He made 2 or 3 steps, and stopping with crossed arms before Godfrey, asked, "Where do you want to go to?" "Everywhere." "And when do you want to start?" "When you please, Uncle Will." "All right," replied William W. Colderup, fixing a curious look on his nephew. Then he muttered between his teeth, "The sooner the better." At these last words came a sudden interruption from Fina. The little finger of her left hand touched a G, and the fourth had, instead of falling on the keynote, rested on the sensible, like Ralph in the Huguenots, when he leaves at the end of his duet with Valentine. Perhaps Fina's heart was nearly full. She had made up her mind to say nothing. It was then that William W. Colderup, without noticing Godfrey, approached the piano. "Fina," said he gravely, "you should never remain on the sensible." And with the tip of his large finger, he dropped vertically on to one of the keys, and an unnatural resounded through the room. Chapter 4, in which T. Artelet, otherwise Tartlet, is duly introduced to the reader. If T. Artelet had been a Parisian, his compatriots would not have failed to nickname him Tartlet, but as he had already received this title, we do not hesitate to describe him by it. If Tartlet was not a Frenchman, he ought to have been one. In his Itinéraire de Paris à Jerusalem, Chateaubriand tells of a little man, powdered and frizzed in the old-fashioned style, with a coat of apple green, a waistcoat of drooged, shirt frill and cuffs of muslin, who scraped a violin and made the Iroquois dance, Madeleine Friquet. The Californians are not Iroquois, far from it, but Tartlet was nonetheless professor of dancing and deportment in the capital of their state. If they did not pay him for his lessons, as they had his predecessor in beaver skins and bare hams, they did so in dollars. If in speaking of his pupils, he did not talk of the bucks and their squaws, it was because his pupils were highly civilized, and because, in his opinion, he had contributed considerably to their civilization. Tartlet was a bachelor, and aged about 45 at the time we introduce him to our readers. But for a dozen years or so, his marriage with a lady of somewhat mature age had been expected to take place. Under present circumstances, it is perhaps advisable to give 2 or 3 lines concerning his age, appearance, and position in life. He would have responded to such a request, we imagine, as follows, and thus we can dispense with drawing his portrait from a moral and physical point of view. He was born on the 17th July, 1835, at 3:15 in the morning. His height is 5 feet, 2 inches, 3 lines. His girth is exactly 2 feet, 3 inches. His weight, increased by some 6 pounds during the last year, is 151 pounds, 2 ounces. He has an oblong head. His hair, very thin above the forehead, is grey chestnut. His forehead is high, his face oval, his complexion fresh-colored. His eyes sight excellent, a greyish-brown, eyelashes and eyebrows clear chestnut, eyes themselves somewhat sunk in their orbits beneath the arches of the brows.